Today I'm going to show you a great way to use your scrap vinyl for a really pretty project. I decided to make one big sticker, a stencil, and some smaller stickers all for a crayon pot, but you can apply this method to make something that you would actually like. Step 1, decide what you want to make and measure up. Once the pot was measured, I set to work designing this project. There was one thing I forgot to take into account with this project, which I will tell you about when the vinyl goes on the mat. First of all, I headed to Design Space and to my canvas. I started with what I'm calling the stencil first of all, and so went to the Shapes tab and picked a rectangle with curved edges. I then changed the size to make sure it would fit onto the side of the pot. Quick tip is to take into account any surfaces that dip or are slightly rounded, as well as any bits that hang over from the lid, and then decide if you want your vinyl to be under this or around this or not when sizing everything up. I then set to work on the wording. I wrote the word crayon and started to choose a font. I knew I wanted the word to be all lowercase and look playful and very readable, so I chose Cricut Sans. A tip with choosing fonts is to move your word to the side and then duplicate it so that you can see what you're working with, and then compare fonts as you change each duplicate until you find one that you like. I highlighted my word, crayon, clicked attach, and then dragged this on top of my rectangle. I changed the colour of the wording to red. This part isn't actually important as I was going to be using a lot of different colours, but I just wanted the wording to stand out. I resized the wording to make sure it would fit into my stencil and still be readable. It was at this point that I wondered if I would be able to use this to create both the wording and the stencil, seeing as I was cutting it all at once. Spoiler, I could not, and I will show you why when we get there. Just in case, I copied the text and moved it to the side anyway. I tried to center the word on the rectangle, but it didn't quite look right, so I positioned this manually. I then highlighted the rectangle and the text and clicked attach. I clicked make to work on the stencil. It is now time to use those scraps. As mentioned, there was one thing I didn't think to take into account, and that was the size of my scraps. I knew I had lots of different colours and sizes, but didn't quite realise how small some of my scraps were, and sadly some were just too small for this stencil. Don't worry though, as I've still managed to use them later in this project. That just might be something you want to think about when choosing the size of your project. I personally didn't mind if I used permanent or removable vinyl or a mix of both, and so grabbed whatever I had to hand. I arranged the scraps randomly on my mat, roughly lining them up at the top. I actually decided to cut a small line of yellow vinyl for this project because I don't ever use this yellow and have a huge roll of it from a bundle that I ordered. I tried to make sure that I didn't overlap the scraps and attached masking tape to help keep all of the scraps together. I also decided at the same time to put some scraps on the other end of the mat for the lettering. I double checked that my stencil design would fit on my scraps and clicked make. Once cut, I had thoughts that I might be able to peel the letters away from the stencil and use both, but try as I might, I couldn't make it work and got super frustrated and gave up on the idea. If you have any ideas of how to cut the stencil and the wording and keep both, please let me know. I lightly popped masking tape over the top of the stencil to keep the scraps together. I then weeded the letters and the outside of the stencil. I removed the masking tape, applied transfer tape, and firmly stuck it down. When it came to the word crayon, I had to be more careful. Once cut, I popped the masking tape on top of the vinyl to keep the scraps together before flipping it over and putting masking tape on the back. I flipped it over again and took off the masking tape from the front. Be careful though, as it can actually start to take off some of your vinyl. I then weeded around the letters and had to be really slow and careful when I did. I then applied transfer tape and used the scraper to make sure it was firmly stuck on. I used masking tape to roughly mark where the wording was going. I peeled off the backing and attached crayons to the side of the pot. I scraped it down before removing the masking tape and the transfer tape. I repeated the exact same process for the stencil. With my small scraps, I decided to make some shapes to decorate the gaps on the box with. I went back to my canvas and used the Shapes tab to pick out shapes I wanted. I added them all to my canvas and resized them. I wanted to make sure that they were a little smaller than the lettering. I decided to cut them all at the same time and so clicked make. I positioned my scraps on the mat and spaced them out in a way that I could match them up on Design Space. I took time with this, making sure that I wouldn't waste any vinyl. I then cut them and hoped I had positioned everything correctly. I then weeded around my shapes before attaching the transfer tape, scraping them down and peeling off the backing. I roughly positioned them until I was happy with the spacing. I then used the scraper to make sure they were stuck down really well before removing the transfer tape. Once my vinyl was firmly attached, all I needed was crayons to make my pot perfect.